All right, so at the end of the last demo, we had created our own brush, and it's here at the very end. And I can make it lots of different sizes. Up, I'm on the eraser. There it is, right? It's good to have a brush that has a slight angle to it, a slight direction to it. You see how mine's a little bit wider than it is tall? But the problem is with just the default brush settings that I have right now, even though it's at 55% opacity, I can make it basically only one size, right, when I hit with it. So it's not pressure sensitive for size, and it's not pressure sensitive for opacity, and it's also always going at the same angle. So even though I spent all this time making this really, really kind of handmade looking brush, when I paint with it, it's going to look very digital, very repetitive. So how can we fix that? It's all about brush settings. So if you go to your brush can in your little tool shortcuts, or if you go to Window, Brush, every brush preset that you choose, and that's what we created our own brush preset, you can customize through these shape options. So the first one I always use is called Shape Dynamics. So click on that. It's like adjusting layer styles on a layer. If you click on Shape Dynamics, you can control the size based on pen pressure, which is why we use it as tablet. And then what's nice is you can actually jitter the size. So even though you're controlling it with pressure, it's not always going to be exactly uniform, which is a lot more like a real brush or a real pastel or a piece of charcoal. So I like to give it a little bit of size jitter. So now what does it look like? Well, now when I press lightly, it's very light. When I press bigger, it's big. But notice it also varies a little bit, which is a lot more like a brush. It's still only going one direction though. So the next thing I'm going to do is the angle jitter. And that's going to simply rotate it as I go. So now, that makes all the difference. Now it looks like a pretty organic brush because it's not repeating the same angle, and instead the edges look truly random to it. Make sense? So those two, they're just under Shape Dynamics, size jitter and angle jitter. You can play with the other settings. I like to kind of play around with the brush before I get started, so I can play with rounding it a little bit. If I think that's helpful. I can set limits. And then some of the other tools that you might use for other brushes or you might use later, scattering turns it into kind of an airbrush where you can extend it out, right? Make it a textured brush instead. But obviously for painting, this is going to be a little unpredictable. And so you can turn them off as you go as well. Texture, I wouldn't recommend at the beginning, but you can put a slight texture into the brush, especially when you're mixing colors. It can make it look like there's a canvas behind or a rough paper behind everything, and it's helpful for watercolor brushes. And you can play with the brightness, contrast, and depth. So there you can see it. I'll make it really, really faint. So just to break up the interior. So even when you press really, really hard with black, there's still a little bit breaking it up. And just lots of others. So someone mentioned wet edges. So if you want it to act more like it's always a little bit softer at the edges than in the middle, you can use the wet edge brush. And you can see how that kind of satellites everything. So it's like staining off of the edge. And that's good for wet media effects. Maybe I'll try that this time. I don't usually use it. And you have control of most of these. Wet edges is pretty much a one and done kind of thing. And then smoothing, I always have smoothing on. I honestly don't really know what it does. But it doesn't seem like a bad thing. I don't put protect texture on because then that looks like extremely uniform across everything you do. So this is my basic brush. Shape dynamics, most important thing. Texture, very subtle. Wet edges, if you want to try it, that's my experiment this time. And smoothing. Because I always am trying to learn. So already, just playing with this brush at this size, at 55% opacity, I'm able to make something that doesn't look so automatically digital. You know, this is starting to look kind of like an ink wash painting in some sort of absorbent paper. And that's what I'm interested in, because this is one of my references, right? Okay, now how do I get started on my painting? So I've already set it up. I showed you with a regular brush. Let me show you what that would look like with my new brush. It won't look as flat, won't look as normal, but it's the same basic idea. I'm going to go on my rough sketch layer. I have a protected white layer underneath. I'm going to set my brush at a size that is not too picky, pretty much bigger than I'm comfortable with because it's pressure sensitive. So if I want to get more fine-tuned, I just don't touch as or press as hard. So maybe, I don't like how it jumps like that, but I'm thinking maybe around 800 pixels. Yeah, so that's a pretty good size for the brush, but it would only fill that whole size if I push really hard. And then for opacity, I'm going to start at a pretty high opacity. Probably not 100%, even though I have the wet edges turned on, but pretty high, about 90%. Because this first stage of painting, this is what I call kill whiting. I want to get rid of all the whites with my own color choices. And it's nice and memorable because it sounds revolutionary. All right, so how do we do it? We're on our rough sketch layer. We steal color by holding down the Option key. Now this is the rough sketch speed painting approach. So I am not going to do a pencil sketch underneath. I am not going to diagram his face. I'm just going to see what happens. So I call this speed painting or shape painting. I guess I'll call it shape painting because who knows how fast I'll be. Okay, so what do? Just like I started here, I'm just going to grab a color, start looking at the big shapes, start blocking them in. Try to look at big shapes first. Don't worry about detail. Basically, the theory with digital art is you need to see what you've got before you can adjust it. So we have to get rid of all of this white because it's overpowering our decisions at this point. And if I wanted to, I could even steal some colors from this, from my inspiration. Throw some monkey wrenches in there. What's fun about stealing color from reference is you'll always be kind of surprised by what you get. Yeah, I'm liking this wet edges effect. And then you can start stealing colors from yourself if you want to. And then as you kind of get the shape roughed out, then you can start getting more and more targeted. Okay, so now I have a feeling kind of for where the eyebrows are going to go, which helps me understand the direction of the head. Remember, older men are easier than women and young people because they've got all this topography I can use, all these wrinkles. Lots of fun to paint. I'm using the older photos of James Baldwin, more from the 70s and 80s than from the 60s, just because his face has a little bit more character with age. The slightly receded hairline, the bigger nose, the salt and pepper hair, all of that's going to be more fun for me to paint. And I think it kind of reveals his character a little bit. Than just showing an attractive young black man. If I were to do a portrait of Barack Obama, I'd want post-presidency. Get all those wrinkles, all the skin damage, and all the stress hair. Makes for better paintings. You could choose Donald Trump from pretty much any time in his life. Some interesting things. All right, so what is the difference here? Why is this a shape painting? Well, I am painting with the biggest brush I can, pretty much at 100% opacity, and I am not being very careful, right? I am not making lines in any way. I'm building up shapes and then painting over them. And I'm not ever going to use the eraser. I'm just going to paint with other colors. So on this layer, if I want white, like for instance, if I want white for his eye, I'm going to paint white. And just to show that off, I'll make another background color or background layer that I fill in with 50% gray. So you can see. The kill whitey is to actually make your own decisions about value, not to let this white background kind of do all the work for you. So I might switch to that gray background, lock it, and keep painting. And I'm still forcing myself to use this really, really big brush. Because it forces me to not get hung up in little details. Okay, now what's the danger of doing the shape painting? It's great for a caricature. It's great for a quick sketch. But I am likely making lots of little observational mistakes in terms of the proportions of his face. And if I'm really going for a likeness, this might not match the facial anatomy of my subject matter. Even though I'm basing it mostly on one photo, this might not be the best way of going about it. But let me throw some highlights in before I show you another approach. Yeah, so for instance, I can see that his eye is closer to the inside. Let me just put that in. Don't be afraid of color. Some digital painters, especially ones that go for very photorealistic or representational, will do everything in grayscale first. Because value is actually more important than color. And then they'll colorize later. And that's just being, very careful. And there's nothing wrong with that. But for speed painting, it's all about kind of capturing personality. And for caricature, I say go for some crazy color. Work with it. You're always safe using red around the eyes. So this is going to give me a painting that has a lot of personality, but it's not necessarily going to be a correct representation of him. And clearly it's not. His face is too flat on this side. I don't have the tilt of his head. I need to push this back. Luckily, because this is digital, I can actually do that with warp tools and different techniques. But what if I really want to study how his face is made up? How could I start this painting in a different way? Well, that would be kind of the traditional rough sketching way. And if you're an oil painter, you might do this in charcoal on the canvas. Or if you're doing watercolor, you might do it with pencil. Let's get his hairline in here. All right, so I've got this. There's a lot about it I'm liking. But I'm going to start a new layer. I'm going to lock this, turn it off.